investing in property makes sense. Investing in the right property takes knowledge. Welcome to the Rewarding Property Decisions podcast. I'm Jarrod McCabe, Director of Wakeland Property Advisory. Join me for expert insights into the fundamentals, trends and opportunities to help you create long-term wealth through smart property decisions. Hi everyone and welcome to episode 72 of the Rewarding Property Decisions podcast. Advancements in technology have certainly changed all of our lives in many ways, and I'm sure they will continue to do so for many, many years to come. So whether that's for work or for recreation or health or education, it continues to make advancements, which is certainly benefiting all of us. And the property industry is obviously no different to that. It's changed significantly in my 25 years within the industry. It's really been phenomenal, some of the advancements and changes that have come into play, helping both buyers and vendors alike. So the big query, I guess, is whether or not all of these changes have been beneficial to everyone, or whether or not they need to be viewed with a healthy sense of skepticism, or even in some instances, perhaps given a very wide berth. So I thought today we could have a look at some of the changes that have occurred in the past 25 odd years, and how they've helped buyers and sellers, or how perhaps they've been a bit more of a hindrance to either side of the property transaction process. So let's have a look at it from a positive perspective to start with. So some of the pros, and probably the biggest advancement in the last 25 years, not just for property, but for society as a whole, has been the internet. And as a result of that, real estate websites have really come into their own. So sites like realestate.com.au and obviously domain.com.au are the big players within Australia. And they really are now a driving force within the market. Basically, if you're looking to sell your home or apartment property, what have you, if you're not on the real estate websites, you may as well be selling off market, because that's where I would say 95% of buyers are coming, or even probably higher than that, coming across your property, unless they're possibly a dormant buyer, in which case they may well be finding something in some forms of print advertising. But more often than not, you've got to be on the real estate websites to get the market coverage. And what that does is it provides buyers particularly with so much information. I mean, when we first started in the industry, it was very much print advertising. And so you would get a small blurb, and you might get a facade photo or one internal photo, and that would be about it. Nowadays, with the real estate websites, you'll get probably as little as 8, but in many instances 15 to 20 photos. There'll be floor plans, property-specific information in the blurb, and it's not just a 2-line paragraph. It's far more detailed than that, giving you a lot of information about the property. You'll get location maps as well, and now particularly in Victoria, you get the statement of information. So that provides specific sales evidence and a specific quote that's required by law, as well as obviously the agent's details and then any upcoming open for inspection times, that sort of thing. So it's a significant amount of information that can be provided and gained by a buyer that previously you just weren't able to determine before going out and inspecting a property. And agents regularly report now that they get far fewer inquiries when a property goes online in terms of direct contact with them, because buyers feel as though they've got enough information to determine whether or not they like a property, or certainly whether they'll inspect a property just by viewing it on the real estate website. So it's been a significant change within the market. Another is Google Maps, and that's obviously changed a lot for everyone, but it really can give you, as a buyer, particularly, a very good understanding of what's around a property, what some of the surrounding uses are, and whether they may be offensive from a buyer's perspective or from a livability point of view. The street view allows you to look at the consistency of the streetscape and what's happening around you. But it also really gives you a great context as to important factors to why you may want to be in a certain location. So distances from schools, for instance, which may determine whether or not you're in a specific school zone that may well be important to you, how far away from work you are, how far away from public transport, from parklands, from shops, and other recreation facilities. So Google Maps gives a lot of context and helps people to really determine whether or not a location is going to be suitable to them. Another one, and I think this is a really important one and an important development, probably in business in general, and that flows on to real estate, but is CRM systems. So what that does for real estate it's progressed so much in terms of information gathering. And from a seller and a vendor's perspective, it's putting them in a very strong position to analyse buyers and look at what they're doing. They collect huge amounts of data just by gathering information and feedback and conversations that they have with prospective buyers during inspections. And it enables them to determine what other properties buyers might be looking at, if it's within the same agency, and the level of interest that they've had. And then in some instances, whether or not they've perhaps bid or put offers in on other properties and the level of interest that they've had in, and what the price points that those properties have been at. So agents start to get a really clear picture as to where buyers are sitting, what sort of other properties they've been looking at, whether or not their property fits in with that, whether or not the budget fits in, whether or not they might be able to stretch a bit further with the budget. So it gathers a lot of information, and it gives vendors a real insight into what buyers are thinking, where they might be, and puts them in a strong position along with their agent to then determine whether or not a buyer is going to be the right person for their property. So that's really helped from a selling perspective. Another one is video conferencing or video calls, that sort of thing, because it allows virtual walkthroughs of properties which otherwise you previously wouldn't have been able to do. So for buyers that are looking at purchasing properties, particularly investments, but if you're interstate or overseas and perhaps looking to move back home to a different city, well, you're able to get a great feel for a property by having, whether it be a buyer's advocate or whether it be having a friend or family member or even the sales agent walk you through the property on a video call to give you a virtual tour to show you what's going on in that place. Now, it doesn't replace walking through and feeling it underfoot yourself, but it certainly could give you an insight as to whether or not a property is worth taking to the next level. And it certainly can save a lot of money in having to make plane trips and things backwards and forwards. If you are of the mindset that you do feel as though you need to inspect a property. Some people are comfortable not. I would certainly advise, particularly for a home, if you can inspect a property, it's a good idea to. But it can be a really good first step as well. But also from an investment perspective, where it may not have the emotional attachment, it can give you a far greater feel to a property as well. Another one that's come along probably a lot since COVID particularly, are the online bidding services that are now in play. So apps like Gavel or Anywhere Auctions, and there are plenty others as well, give buyers the ability to actually bid at auction without being at the site or having to have someone else do it for them. Now, it's always good to be at an auction. Again, it doesn't. These online services can't help you to see everything that's going on, but they can certainly, while you've got access to internet, provide you with the ability to watch an auction, see the auctioneer, hear other bids, and then obviously control your own bidding at your own pace and when you want to bid, how often and how much. So they've really stepped up during COVID times where there needed to be steps forward within the real estate industry to help people come through with the times and get a feel for being able to bid, because a lot of vendors do prefer selling via auction, and that was something that was a little bit concerning to start with. So it came along in very quick timing as well, because as with a lot of things during COVID, but it's certainly come a long way, and I think in a lot of instances works quite well. So there's some great services in that online bidding area. Another is, from a positive perspective, and probably one of my favourites, is the digital contracts these days and digital signatures and authorities. It's amazing how much that's changed things. We used to sit down after bidding at an auction, and an auction might take you 15 minutes, and then there'd be 5 contracts, paper contracts, lined up on a table if you were successful, and the agents would have to fill all 5 out, then have the buyer sign all the relevant spots and initial the relevant spots, and then have the vendor do the same thing, and then they'd have to post out the paperwork to the vendors and buyers' solicitors come Monday. And so it was a very time-consuming process, and it would comfortably take an hour normally on the Saturday, plus timing afterwards. Nowadays, with iPads and even iPhones and things when needed, you can have both parties have both contracts executed. Vendor, buyer, vendor solicitor, buyer solicitor, and agent can all have executed forms of that contract, including the auction, within half an hour of it starting. It's just amazing. It's really advanced things a lot. And then further to that has probably been the ability to pay deposits via online transfers. Now, there's a program that or software that Macquarie Bank has brought in known as DEFT, which is Direct Electronic Funds Transfer, which has been fantastic as well. There were certainly agencies around Melbourne that as little as 5 years ago were still insisting that if you couldn't bring a cheque to an auction on a Saturday, that you had to bring $1,000 cash because they needed to have that down payment made. And it was staggering that it's taken the real estate industry this long to get to this point. But again, COVID has had its positives, and this program's really come to the fore with a lot of agencies around Melbourne. And it's the ability to do that direct electronic funds transfer on a Saturday without having to worry about daily transfer limits has really helped the industry progress very, very well. So a lot of real positives in terms of technology that have helped the industry tick along in the last few years. Some of the, I guess, let's look at it from the cons perspective, and it probably is a flip side of what I mentioned earlier, the information gathering through the CRM systems that vendors and agents have, is that information gathering can be make it difficult from a buyer's perspective because agents know a lot about you. So buyers are always concerned about saying too much to agents, and it can be even more so now because they know a lot. Just by the amount of properties that you inspect, what properties you inspect, the price brackets that you're looking at, the condition of the properties that you're looking at. So they do gather a lot of information on you. And so it's just something that you need to be very mindful of, and how much information you do disclose to an agent. But there's a balance to that too, because if you don't disclose a certain amount, then you won't get opportunities with off-market properties, that sort of thing as well. So you just need to deal with it with a healthy sense of skepticism. But the information gathering from a buyer's perspective is something that you do need to be very, very wary of. Those CRMs are phenomenal with how much information they hold. Probably one of the frustrations that I have as a former valuer are some of the real estate websites that provide valuations and assessments on properties. They can quite often provide users with a very unrealistic expectation of what a property's value might be, both from a buying or if it's your own home, that side of things, because they do heavily rely on statistical analysis, which can work really well, but it can also fail to utilise certain aspects of what you do take into account when assessing a property's value. Now, we speak regularly with our clients about how to assess a property's value. You will have heard many times on the podcast things that we do consider. And the things that we do talk about is that it relies on part science, but it also relies on part art. And these websites are far more focused on the science side of things, because unless you've got a person who can interpret things, the art side of things doesn't come into play. And so they can all of a sudden be quite a fair way off base. So the art side of things relies on someone interpreting sales evidence or aspects of a property in a particular way. So for instance, a sale being at arm's length or being known to parties won't necessarily be taken into account with with statistical analysis. Or has the property been renovated and how recently? And what some of the adjoining uses or surrounding development might be. It's not necessarily able to interpret that as well. So these are just some of the small things where these websites don't take that into account, and they can give very, very wide-ranging assessments as well. So they can be quite frustrating because they can give buyers and vendors a false sense of where value does actually sit. And then the final one is probably, look, this is good and bad, but the amount of information that some of these real estate websites do provide can become quite overwhelming and almost give too much information, which can then mean that you don't know what to do with it or how to interpret it. The amount, there's so much there, as I said before, the photos, the floor plan, the location, it's a lot to take in. But nothing really replaces actually walking through a property and getting the feel for it yourself. Many people will rely heavily on these websites to determine whether or not they're actually even going to inspect a property, which can be very dangerous because sometimes the photos can look really, really good. Sometimes they can look quite poor, and then you get there and actually the property presents quite well. Or you might look at something with Google Maps, for instance, and see that there's an aerial shot and you're concerned about an adjoining use, but when you actually get there, that adjoining use is no longer there anymore. So sometimes you've got to be a little bit careful about getting too much information and making decisions based on online information without actually pounding the pavement and getting through properties and physically inspecting them to really know where things sit. There's an old saying that we use a lot, and it's information is not knowledge. You can get a lot of information off these websites, but until you actually know how to interpret it and build your knowledge base of areas, that sort of thing, be very careful about having too much reliance on the information that's gathered from those websites without actually being able to put it into effect. So I thought today, and that probably some of my recent comments takes me to the case study for today, and there's so much information here and so many experiences that we have that we could put into play here. But one of them is based on one of the website assessments that I mentioned before. And we had a client come to us a few years ago quite concerned about the value of their apartment. And they'd looked at one of the assessment websites, and it had said that their property was worth only around $300,000. And it sometimes you'll see that they say low confidence, confident, or high confidence, mid-level confidence. And this one was high-level confidence at $300,000. And they'd paid $400,000 for it only a few years earlier. And so we had to look into it for them. And once we dug a bit deeper, we realised that the reason was that there'd been another sale of a similar apartment within that block for only $300,000 within the last 3 months. However, digging a bit deeper, that sale was actually not on market, and it was a family transfer between related parties. So not arm's length. And once you actually looked a bit deeper and looked at comparable sales that weren't in between related parties and were on market, the property was comfortably worth $450,000 to $500,000. So a significant difference. So again, that brings me back to that point of these websites don't have that art element. It's purely based on the science side of things. So it's not necessarily reflective of value. So that's why I'm always a little bit skeptical around them. So it just gives you a bit of a practical example of some of the things that we have seen. So just in summary, I guess, generally I would say that the advancements in technology have absolutely aided the real estate industry and buyers and sellers within it. It's more often than not, they're fantastic. The online auctions, the digital contracts, the websites and the amount of information that you can get, it really helped both sides of the transaction process. I think the key is to never solely rely on the technology and still ensure that there is a healthy reliance on your gut instinct. I think that's a really important part to determine whether or not things are going to be right for you specifically, particularly when it comes to buying a home. I think that's a really, really important fact to keep in mind. So thanks for joining me for episode 72 of the Rewarding Property Decisions podcast. As always, please feel free to share the podcast far and wide with friends, family and colleagues and anyone else that may have an interest in property. And if you'd like further information on how to make rewarding property decisions, please visit our website, wakeland.com.au. And as always, we wish you the best with your property decisions.